Right now, while Indigenous people represent about 4% of the Canadian population, they make up about 32% of the entire federal prison population.
Even more appalling, Indigenous youth accounted for 50% of custody admissions, while representing 8% of the Canadian youth population.
But the worst part is that these proportions have been drastically trending upwards for the past decades, while the rates of non-Indigenous offenders in prison have gone way down. So what's the reason behind the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the criminal justice system? And what can we do to solve this?
To understand what's happening, we first need to talk about past colonialist policies. You see, the government has been trying to assimilate Indigenous peoples in horrible ways,
including forcing children to go into residential schools, removing Indigenous children from their families during the 60s Stoop, and implementing the dictates of the Indian Act.
Colonialism has led to cultural alienation, territorial dispossession, and intergenerational trauma, all of which have had tragic results like physical and mental health problems.
A lot of Indigenous people have been trying to cope with this pain and trauma by turning to things like alcohol and drugs and inflicting violence upon others, which only contributes to them being arrested more often.
Furthermore, colonialism has caused and led to socioeconomic marginalization. Due to these policies, Indigenous people have a higher unemployment rate and lower levels of education compared to non-Indigenous people.
As well, they have disproportionately inadequate housing and much poorer health, leading to more poverty.
These conditions make it really difficult for Indigenous people to gain life opportunities to support their future, causing them to be in more contact with the justice system.
But beyond the problem of colonialist policies that cause Indigenous people to be in a position where they are more likely to commit a crime, there is also systemic discrimination in policing and courts that contribute even more to overrepresentation in prisons.
A lot of Indigenous communities are currently being very aggressively overpoliced.
Consequently, more people are incarcerated and they go to court in large numbers.
But at the same time, these communities are also being under-policed, which doesn't mean they don't have enough police officers. Rather, it implies that the legitimate claims of Aboriginal people that their rights are being violated are not taken as seriously as the claims of non-Aboriginal people.
This explains the human rights crisis of the missing and murdered Indigenous woman.
In court, Indigenous people also face difficulties hiring good lawyers and are significantly more often denied bail due to harmful stereotypes and poverty. They are also underrepresented in juries, meaning they don't have a say in the verdict of a trial, especially if it involves Indigenous offenders or victims.
So, how has the government already tried to solve this serious issue?
Starting in 1999, the government has used GLADU reports, which contain information on the unique circumstances of Indigenous people, including lived traumas, family history, poverty level, educational levels, and drug and alcohol use. This information is supposed to give the court a complete picture of the defendant's life in order for the court to reduce the sentencing or to even offer alternatives to prison for Indigenous offenders.
So, did it work? Well, since the starting of the GLADU reports in 1999, the number of Indigenous offenders has actually increased annually, from 17% to 37%.
So why didn't GLADU reports solve the problem? First of all, most of Canada treated GLADU principles as though they were a nuisance, calling it a get-out-of-jail-free card. Furthermore, Corrections Canada actually started to use the well-intended GLADU reports as evidence of an Indigenous offender's likelihood to recommit that same crime, so started locking them in prison for an even longer period.
How can we actually solve this issue?
There are many obvious and shallow approaches, such as changing criminal code regarding sentences, solving issues with bail and remand, making better rehabilitation programs, and enforcing community police services. But let's discuss a deeper approach.
What if we allow Indigenous people to have their own ways of justice? While Western justice systems focus more on retribution and punishment, Indigenous ideas of justice revolve around the idea of rehabilitation, community reintegration, and healing. These restorative approaches allow the offender to connect and resolve problems with the victims and the community as a whole.
For example, an Indigenous offender may be counseled by their elders and link hands around the fireplace with their community in order to restore trust and harmony. These approaches have been traditionally used for thousands of years, way before colonists ever took over America.
So when Aboriginal people are required to fit into a system that does not recognize their values, this contributes to overrepresentation. This is why we need to get more people to support the idea of restorative justice.
Only when we raise awareness can we finally start understanding and trusting Indigenous values.
And then, can we slowly diminish the outrageously high percentages of Aboriginal people trapped in the justice system?
And then, can we finally open up a pathway to the future and allow Indigenous people to run justice according to their own traditional values?